Good morning and welcome to Blain's Morning Porridge. It's February 2nd, 2026. This morning, global markets skating on very thin ice. Let's start with a quote and make it a happy one. Let's paint the town. We'll shut it down. And just how thick is that ice? Everything juddered last week, from AI perceptions of geopolitics to gold, you name it. There are so many takeaways. Are markets vulnerable to an AI credit cascading event? Just how vulnerable are the middle nations? J-cake, that's Japan, Canada, Australasia, Korea, and Europe. China looks to be a rising risk. And just how well will the USA handle a potential crisis? Is this the time to exit gold? But where to go? So many questions and so few answers. And as has been said so many times before, there are decades when nothing happens and weeks when decades happen. The world is a complex place, and I got a feeling we are skating on very thin ice indeed. Now, apologies for the lack of porridge last week. I was at an annual Interbourse ski week with over 400 other market folks, and there was plenty to talk about. I listened, watched, and now I'm trying to draw some conclusions, which isn't easy because there is so much to consider. Now, experience teaches us that wobbles and crashes are exciting and often expensive, but markets swiftly bounce back stronger. And since 2010, a whole market generation has grown up believing in what we call the Fed put, convinced that any market threat will be averted by bailouts and central bank support. Thus, every price tumble isn't analysed for lessons to be learnt or what caused it and how to avoid making the same mistakes, but is simply seen as a buy the dip opportunity. And that worries me about markets. And if we are in for a correction now, this time it might be different. In the past, traders, investors, governments, treasuries, central banks have all been professionally aligned and determined to create solutions and foster global market stability. But that's no longer a given. There is less sense of doing the right thing for the sake of doing that right thing. Today, it's more about self-interest, which is incompatible with trust, the fundamental driver of stable capitalist markets. Now, what are the critical points for markets to think about? And I stress these are only some. There are many that I'm still trying to get my head around, and that includes what we're going to see with global economy in terms of inflation versus stagflation opportunities or threats. But let's start off with the US Fed, one of the big pieces of noise from last week. And apparently the markets are very happy because Trump has nominated Kevin Warsh as the new Fed chair. Phew, relief rally. Yet markets are opening very weak again this morning, and the perception is Warsh is not a complete Trump-tard or a sycophantic lackey, but he's very close to Scott Bessent, the US Treasury Secretary, and he fought a very clever campaign to undermine his rivals to win the nomination, which all makes me think about would-be Roman emperors who would bribe the Praetorian Guard to win the laurel crown of the Caesars. I'm just saying. The US papers say that Warsh will manage Trump by whispering gently in his ear, not the other way around, but let's wait and see what happens. What really intrigued me, though, was Trump didn't praise Warsh's economic background, such as it is, or his achievements in his previous terms. Instead, the president talked about Warsh's film star looks as if that's a prerequisite for a Fed chair, and that sums up the big issue. Leaders are only as good as their teams, and that becomes acutely apparent in times of crisis. How well would the Trump cabinet handle crisis? Have you ever come across the expression Potemkin village? Well, if not, I'll be happy to explain on an email. Let's talk about gold, bonds, stocks, and start off with AI. For the big picture, look at the details. The trade of the day in the credit markets is buying protection on Oracle, and it looks a busted flush on rising debt costs and falling margins as the costs of the AI infrastructure build out start to soar. Look at the price of copper, for instance. On the back of stories of massive write-offs in some of the more speculative private credit markets, that's souring sentiment and raising concerns about just how sustainable this current credit market is. And in the past, it's usually been the credit markets that have triggered problems. Now, Oracle could be the first pebble to visibly tumble down the hill, potentially triggering a cascading credit landslide. Now, keep a close eye on the flood of comments and announcements about how much AI-related firms are now trying to roll back on the circularity of financing that exists between them. Nvidia is no longer talking about hundreds of billions of investment, but mere billions into other companies to buy its chips, and doubts swiftly multiply. It might be time for a rethink on some of the more highly speculative IPOs that are planned for later this year, and I have a personal feeling that the biggest losers will be the speculative hypesters like Elon Musk and Sam Altman. Now, when exchanges increase margin requirements, as they did on gold and silver last week, that's always a very toppy signal. Gold is already down 18% from the top that it made last week. Now, we can fret about what gold's tumble and the rising concerns on AI build-out costs actually mean, and to that add all the doubts about where the dollar is going, but it's clear that risk appetites are fundamentally changing, and if the current wobble turns into a crash, then I think the surprise might be how quickly treasuries get hammered. Now, if treasuries are no longer the global store of value that they once was, well, what do you sell into a crash if you have to meet margin requirements? And that's one of the things that's got me more worried about gold. It now may be not the safe haven asset that you hold, but the one you need to sell. And that would trigger downside in the gold yellow metal. Perversely, in this world of rising risk, I find myself beginning to think that it's time to take profits on gold, even though the market is down 20%. But where would you park the proceeds? Which leads us on to geopolitics. Now, Sir Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, could not have picked a worse week to have visited China. The last thing on the beleaguered Emperor Xi's agenda was to play nice with a middling European state. And as I suggested last Monday, it now increasingly looks like Xi averted a possible coup, but his control of the party and the state is less than we thought. And if Europe thought that China was going to welcome them into its new Belt and Road co-prosperity sphere as equals, then forget it. What we saw was Trump's world view is the same as Xi's. The strong will dominate the weak. The message sent to the UK was clear. You are small and pitiful and come as supplicants to the Jade Throne. The UK came back from Beijing with nothing. And the takeaways are clear. All the middling small democratic states, the new Mark Carney world of Japan, Canada, Australasia, Korea and Europe, which I'm going to nickname J-Cake, are individually weak. The question is, can they become collectively strong and relevant? Which brings us to defence. The establishment of J-Cake's collective strategic deterrence to deter aggression and demonstrate relevance is absolutely critical. The upside, if they can do that, is greater global stability and increased competition and trade. Tick all the boxes. The challenge, of course, is making it happen. Now, many Western democratic politicians appear to be deliberately blind to the coming challenges, focused on immediate political challenges while denying the reality that the next war has already begun. It's underway in cyberspace, and it's going turned kinetic in Ukraine. It could well turn kinetic elsewhere. And faced with the challenges of out of control welfare costs and soaring budgets, governments, weak politicians who've been fractured by Russian financed right wing populism, are praying for peace to enable them to balance the books. And they're in cloud cuckoo land if they think it's going to happen. This is 1938. Now, I do always say that history never repeats, but it does resonate, and this looks very 1930s. We have to rearm now to create a credible deterrence, and that should be the paramount objective for all the JCAIC nations if they wish to remain relevant. Yet, national interest still dominates thinking in defence. France is a good example. It's trying to block the UK from participation in European defence initiatives, hoping that global instability will cause orders to flow to France's defence industries and that it will float to the surface of the very small European bowl. The UK is also at fault. It's failing to make spending commitments, putting off a big spending announcement until March. And that puts JCAIC's best hope of a sixth generation stealth fighter, the Tempest, at risk. It needs investment now to proceed. It's being developed jointly by the UK, Italy, and Japan. France, of course, wasn't invited because they're just too difficult to work with. But Germany now wants into the project. Fantastic. But it's causing bureaucrats in London, Tokyo, and Rome to fret that their nations might lose shares in the critical contracts in order to entice Luftwaffe orders. The trick should be to get down, build the thing, get it in service, demonstrate to the Americans that we don't need their pretty useless F-35s. The real issue for the JCAIC nations is how much time they have. Xi's purge of the top ranks in the People's Liberation Army in China hints that not all is well. Its much lauded military improvements make people think that China would be unbeatable, but maybe that's what they want us to think. Is the People's Liberation Army really ready to seize Taiwan, or will it take longer to prepare, which seems to be one of the arguments between Xi and his generals? Xi is acutely aware that he faces strategic compression, knowing that the democratic West is waking up and the USA will develop counters to its ballistic and hypersonic carrier killers. That might force Xi to choose to go kinetic earlier in order to consolidate his power base. So what are my conclusions? Well, that's been a very quick ramble round a whole bunch of topics, but they are all connected and they will all affect each other. And it just confirms to me that we are on very thin ice indeed. So my advice is to proceed with caution, and I haven't even written yet about what the potential economic instabilities may well be. Anyway, I'm out of time this morning and I got to get on with a day job. You can find the Morning Porridge on www.morningporridge.com, and if you sign up, you get delivered regularly to your inbox. Right, I'll be back again with something tomorrow, which will hopefully be happier and less worrying. Thank you very much for your time.